Good evening. I hope that you are doing well on this Wednesday evening. We're going to be picking up our study in the Gospel of Belief, the Gospel of John, and we'll be looking at John chapter 18 together tonight as Jesus has just finished his farewell discourse and discussion and closed with a prayer in chapter 17. But that section was chapters 13 through 17, began with the object lesson and then went through to this final discourse and then closed in a prayer that's recorded in chapter 17. And now we move into what is sometimes called the Passion narrative, where Jesus begins his journey to the cross. And so, as we've been following them, you remember in the middle of the discourse, they left the upper room and they're now walking toward or outside of the city of Jerusalem. That's their journey. They're actually going to the Mount of Olives, which we'll see at the beginning of this chapter. And so, we're watching that process unfold. Now, a couple of things about this particular chapter as we walk through it. When you look at the other gospel accounts, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the way they present the way they present their whole gospel is different than the way John does. The message is the same, but the information that they add, that some of them have and some of them do not, it's a little bit different. And sometimes the focus and the emphasis is different. That's why we have to keep in mind that the four gospel accounts are written to different audiences for different purposes. And keeping that in mind helps us to understand and process the information the way the author intended it. So when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see Jesus in the privacy of Gethsemane as he is struggling on the sands of Gethsemane in prayer with God when he asked God to let the cup pass from him. That is not present in John's gospel. It's not that he's saying it's not true, but his main focus as he is walking through this is to show that Jesus is in ultimate control of everything that is happening. The key to helping us understand John's narrative, John's version of this narrative, is John 10, 17, and 18, with the idea that if we're watching it from the outside, we can look at it and think that Jesus has no control over what is happening, that this is all happening to him beyond his control. There's nothing he can do to stop it. But the Gospel of John has been very clear that Jesus is in control of all things, that no one took his life from him, chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, but that he would lay it down willingly of his own accord. And so in this process, we see that Jesus is in ultimate control of what is taking place in these final few hours of his life. And so we're going to look into chapter 18, and that's going to be the fullness of the full chapter of our study. It continues on into chapter 19, but we're going to stop where the chapter divisions are, and then we will press forward. And so what we're going to see tonight is him entering in to the Garden of Gethsemane, going to skip over that time alone with God, as John does, and then the disciples flee, and he's going to move toward his religious trial with the Jews, and we'll see the beginnings of his civil trial with the Roman Empire in that process as well. So let's begin, chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words either have reference to specifically to the prayer of chapter 17, or more likely the entirety of the whole farewell discussion, because you have to remember, as we said, midway through 13, the farewell discussion starts, and chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17, even though we've taken more than a month to study them, they're all in the flow of, just imagine how long it would take you to read it at a simple, steady pace. So it doesn't really take up a lot of time. And so all of that being together is probably what is meant by when he had spoken these words. He went with his disciples across the brook Kidron. Now, we discussed the Kidron in a sermon recently. I believe it was December 27th when we talked about prayer. And we looked at Jesus in his private moments with the Father in the garden. And in that, we discussed the Kidron Valley, which is better known in the Middle East as what is known as a wadi. And a wadi is kind of like a brook. It had dry seasons most of the time. It was just dry and dusty. But during the rainy seasons, it would carry water. And this one actually ended up in the Dead Sea. The Kidron Valley is mentioned. One of the first times we see it in the Old Testament is when David is weeping because his son Absalom has come in to overthrow him. And he is weeping as he crosses the Kidron Valley and goes up the Mount of Olives to flee from his son and the rebellion of Absalom. And so it's a place with a lot of history, the Kidron Valley, as you would exit Jerusalem over to the Mount of Olives. It says, there was a garden which Jesus and his disciples entered. Now, this garden, even as we discussed in that sermon on the 27th, you might go back and there may be a fuller discussion there. I honestly just don't remember at this point. but I know we did discuss this. Um, it seems as if this is a garden. This is an enclosure, that there are walls here. May have been a wealthy disciple of Jesus, that he owned this particular property. Of course, they would use it for farming and different things, but it was also a place to retreat from the city and to relax. Um, Certain Jewish laws said that they needed to remain within a certain distance of Jerusalem during the time periods of feast days. And so Jesus, according to Luke's account, would many times spend the night here on the Mount of Olives and then come back into the city the next morning. And that's at the latter end of Luke 21, I think about verse 37 or so. And so they're going into this place. And about this place, it says, verse 2, now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So this is a common retreat for them. And Judas knew exactly where Jesus would be with the disciples. And you have to think that there's also, as one writer pointed out, God's providence in this as well, that they wanted to arrest Jesus in private because they didn't want to cause a riot. Had they still been in the city and come to arrest him with all the people there and the messianic expectations, especially with Passover, which would have been their thinking, Passover was when God delivered them from Egypt. So what better time for the Messiah to appear than Passover? That is their version of the Messiah to deliver them for the Roman Empire. And so the fact that he was outside of the city perhaps prevented that great riot and a war breaking out, trying to defend him and thinking that he was some kind of a military Messiah. So verse 3, Judas, having procured a band of soldiers or a cohort, and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So first, let's take this slowly. Having procured a band of soldiers or a cohort, roughly 1,000 soldiers in a cohort, would have been somewhere around 760 foot soldiers, 240 cavalry. That's in a normal cohort. Most people believe that this probably was a smaller version of that, around maybe a couple hundred soldiers, which is, when you think about it, and Jesus is going to point this out to them, he's never been a violent man. And so the fact that they're bringing a couple hundred soldiers of Romans, and then you add on top of that officers of the chief priests and the Pharisees, that's the temple guard, the private security guards of the temple that followed the leadership of the Sanhedrin, the private police force, that is. And so you've got a lot of people coming out to arrest Jesus, and they come with lanterns and torches. Now you have to remember they followed a lunar calendar, and so the moon would have been a full moon that night. And so they're bringing lanterns and torches, probably because they think that they think he's a criminal. So they think, like any criminal or revolutionary, that he's going to flee when he sees people coming for him. Of course, that's not going to happen. And so they bring these lanterns, these metal frames and torches with a stick with, some kind of a cloth attached to the top and then on fire, and then with weapons, as if they're going to need him to subdue him or something. Then Jesus, verse 4, knowing that all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, whom do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he, or I am, literally, and we've talked about the importance of that particular designation of God from Exodus 3 and verse 14. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. That is, the soldiers drew back and fell to the ground. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what exactly happened here. Some people view this as they were kind of taken back in the sense of respect for Jesus, and so they bowed down to the ground in his presence. That doesn't seem to fit in my mind, especially with what they're about to do to Jesus. I don't think there was any level of respect for him. Other people see this as a miraculous manifestation, that they were actually knocked down, so to speak, not violently, but just kind of pushed back the force of who Jesus was. There was some kind of a miraculous push against them. I think that's very possible. To be honest with you, I just don't know. And I've always struggled with this particular phrase, not exactly knowing what is happening. But either way, they kind of fall back. I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility for this to be a miraculous kind of pushing back against them, for them to feel the power of who Jesus is. Obviously, he did not hurt them in this process. So they draw back and fall to the ground. So he said to them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. And notice, Who are you seeking? They said Jesus of Nazareth. He said, okay, that's me. Now let them go. He's concerned. He's not going to let his disciples be arrested in this process. And he goes on to explain that. Verse 9, this was to fulfill the word that he has spoken, of those whom you have given me, those whom you gave me, I lost not one. This has reference to the words of his prayer in chapter 17 and verse 12. And so he would not lose any of his disciples in this process. Only Jesus would die and be a sacrifice for sins in this occasion. Verse 10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And so here you see Jesus, and in my opinion, you see Peter doing what he promised he would do. He was willing to die for them. For Jesus. He was willing to defend it. So he takes out this dagger, and I mean, there are multiple possibilities. Number one, the most obvious, I think, is that Peter is a fisherman, and so he's terrible with a dagger, and he just slings it and goes for the head of the soldier and only gets his ear. Or maybe the soldier sees it coming and he kind of ducks, and Peter misses the middle of his head where he was going for and cuts his ear off. Either way, Peter is there to defend Jesus and thinks he's defending Jesus, cuts off Malchus's ear. And of course, in other accounts, the Lord heals his ear, puts it back on. And there are a lot of things that could be explored here, such as Malchus, what happened to him. Obviously, what's amazing is you have a miraculous manifestation of Jesus putting a man's ear back on, who's there to do him harm and to arrest him. And that doesn't seem to really take anybody back. Nobody seems to be really stunned by that the way that they should have been. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? This cup he's been praying about in the privacy of Gethsemane, according to the synoptics. And so this cup, the cup of God's wrath, he's going to have to drink it so that sinners can be saved. He's going to take the wrath of God for those of us who are sinners. And so he's saying, put up the sword. And in the synoptics, he gives multiple explanations for that. First of all, if I wanted protection, I wouldn't look to you for it. I would command legions of angels to do this. Second, those who take the sword perish by the sword. As he's going to say later, my kingdom is not that way. My kingdom is not of this world. We don't fight battles with physical weapons. That's not what we're about. And even though throughout history, some individuals have tried to use the Bible to justify going to war, it's contrary. That is going to war in the name of Christ, making it a holy war. That's contrary to who Jesus is. Jesus never endorsed anything like that. There is never with Jesus conversion by sword or coercion. It is a willing acceptance of who he is. So, verse 12, the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. Now that binding may have some reference to the Old Testament. Remember Genesis 22 and verse 9, Abraham offers Isaac, he binds him and places him on the altar, or Psalm 118 verse 27, which has a number of statements in it that are messianic or that are speaking of Jesus. And in verse 27, it describes the binding of the offering to God. And so there's maybe a symbolic play here that's happening. Verse 13, first they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. So here's some backdrop to what's going on. According to the Old Testament, the high priest served a lifetime in his office. Until he died, he served in that office. Through the intertestament period and some things, the priesthood grew corrupted. Its relationship with the conquering governments, whichever it be, in this case it was Rome, as we're seeing it here. The priesthood sometimes would go to the highest bidder, and who was whoever could pull the strings or would do what Rome wanted them to do, it would go to them. Now, Annas was one of these individuals who kind of rose to that position. Now, he was not technically the high priest at that time, technically, but unofficially he kind of was, because the high priests who served after him were his sons, a son-in-law, as we see here, and even a grandson. And so he was still technically kind of pulling all the strings. He actually served as a high priest from AD 6 to 15 and was later deposed of his position by an individual and was succeeded. Now, his son-in-law was the one that was the high priest that year. That's what it says in verse 13. But Annas is really the one who's kind of in charge. He's kind of like the godfather of what's going on here. He pulls the string. Somebody else might be the figurehead, but he's really the neck that turns that head, so to speak. Verse 14, it was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. This is a reference back to chapter 11 and verse 50 when they were concerned about what was going on after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And so they take him on to this private residence to Annas. Simon Peter, verse 15, followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, most likely a reference to John. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. This is most likely the courtyard of Annas, because this seems to be, there are several indicators within the text, this is in a private residence. The high priest would have lived near the temple compound, and this is a private residence, the gate being kept by a woman. If it had been Caiaphas's house, it would have been in the near the temple, with the gate being kept by temple guards and things along that line. And charcoal fires and things like that indicate it's a private residence. So it seems they go to Annas's private residence. Now, the question is, how is John known by the high priest? We are assuming this is John the disciple, and it seems to make sense. So how is he known? Well, there are two theories behind how he was known to the high priest. One is that John himself was a priest. That is, before he began to follow Jesus, or at minimum, a Levite. And so could have been connected, and there are a number of connections that could be drawn. We're not going to belabor that point. Another possibility is that, of course, John had a successful fishing business with his father, seemed to be pretty well off. They had several employees. When Jesus calls John, he leaves behind several servants working in the boats with his father. And so it's not beyond the realm of possibility that he's just well-to-do, or that he even made deliveries, especially to Annas, and that's how they became acquainted. But either way, he's acquainted with what's going on. He's acquainted with the high priest and is allowed to enter, of course, as someone to be well known. Verse 16, but Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. And so now Peter gets a front row seat to the trial as well. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? It's written in a sense of disdain. Surely you don't follow him, do you? I mean, surely you're not a disciple of this Jesus, right? He said, Peter, I am not. Denial number one. Now, the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire. John is the only account that tells us it was a charcoal fire, because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now, what's interesting is we're going to kind of see this play back and forth for just a second. We're going to see Jesus before the religious council, and then Peter, and then Jesus before the council, and then Peter, and then Jesus before Pilate. Just kind of a cut of scenes back and forth. In verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world, and I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said. They know what I said. And so what Jesus is saying is, you don't need to examine my disciples. Ask anybody. I have not tried to do anything in secret. I haven't been hiding. Now, he's not saying he never taught in private. He certainly would teach his disciples in private. He would certainly teach in certain private settings. But what he's saying is, I'm not some kind of change agent is not the right word. I'm not some kind of subversive individual. I've never tried to hide what I'm doing or what I'm about. I've taught publicly, and people have heard me. I mean, just ask anybody what I've said and what I've taught. If you want to know, then just ask people. Verse 22, when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is this how you answer the high priest? He felt Jesus was being disrespectful, which, of course, would have been a violation of the law, Exodus 22 and verse 28. Of course, Jesus was not being disrespectful. Verse 23, Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Jesus is basically saying, I didn't deserve that. This is supposed to be a fair trial. If I said what was wrong, then answer the wrong. Don't just hit me. And you see, that's the way When people have an agenda, they're not interested in giving reasons because they don't really have any. And well, they do, but the ones that they have, they're not going to admit out loud. And so on this occasion, they're not going to admit that their agenda is that they just simply hate him and don't like him. And so they will resort to violence and just kind of beat him up because that's what I said so. And Jesus is saying that's not the way to conduct a trial. That's not the way to conduct this. If what I said was wrong, then answer the wrong. After that, verse 24, Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So he has to turn him over to Caiaphas because Caiaphas is technically, officially the high priest, and only he can bring Jesus to Pilate on criminal charges. Now the scene cuts back again to Peter in the courtyard. Now Simon Peter, verse 25, was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." Denial number 2. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, that is, a relative of Malchus, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So there's the third denial of Jesus, feeling that pressure coming on from the audience. And of course, you can make the case that what Peter had done was a crime. I mean, he cut off the ear of a servant of the temple, one of the temple guards, is what it seems like. So maybe he's somewhat afraid of having to face that, or even just face the full trial of everything that's going on with Jesus. But the point is that he denies his association with Jesus. So therefore he denies Jesus 3 times. And of course, from the synoptics, we know that hits him very hard. He goes out and weeps bitterly. And as later, as we'll see at the end of this book, is later restored. Even though he denies Jesus 3 times on this occasion, Jesus will make him reaffirm his love for him on 3 occasions in John chapter 21. And so here he has exited. And now we see Jesus taken to Pilate. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, or the praetorium. Now, normally the governor's headquarters, who was over this region, which was Pilate, we'll talk about him in a minute, that he lived in Caesarea, okay? Not Caesarea Philippi, which is where all the great confession took place in Matthew 16, but in Caesarea Maritima, which was on the Mediterranean Sea. You can see it if you get a map of the Mediterranean, Palestine, and see the Mediterranean's up on the northwest corner of Palestine, which borders, of course, against the Mediterranean. So they go to the governor's headquarters, or the praetorium. That is his palace that he lived in there. And the praetorium was the place where judgment was had. And there's still archaeological debate about where the exact location of this is. Was it attached to a fortress in the temple complex, or was it attached to a palace that Herod had built in a different location that, of course, Pilate would have been able to access? Now, Pontius Pilate, he was appointed by Tiberius Caesar in AD 26. He continued to serve in his position until AD 37. He ruled with an iron fist. Luke 13:1 describes one of his atrocities of murdering worshipers. A lot of trouble. He was just kind of ran roughshod over the Jews, and the Jews, in turn, obviously gave him a hard time in that process as well. And so they're going to his headquarters, and early in the morning, very early in the morning, or 5 and 6 and 7 a.m., it says, they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters as the Jewish leaders, so they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. They believed that to go into a Gentile's home was to defile themselves, and that had to do with the theory they believed that Gentiles took their aborted children and flushed them down their drains and buried them that way, and so that made them unclean. And so they would not go into that particular area because they didn't want to be ceremonially unclean. And of course, if you come in contact with a dead body, Numbers chapter 19, I believe, that would make them ceremonially unclean for about 7 days. And so they wanted to partake in the Passover feast. And so in their minds, if they go in there, they're not they're defiled. They become unclean, ceremonially speaking. And so just a second. I'm checking because I want to get that right. Yes, Numbers 19, 11, 14, and 15 talks about the defilement of a week for touching a dead body or being in that proximity. Now, so the scene is this. You have the Praetorium. And so outside of the Praetorium, you see the Jewish leaders because they refuse to enter into that complex. Jesus is taken into this area and is examined privately. And so when you see this narrative in your head, when Pilate is talking to the religious leaders, he's in one location. When he's talking to Jesus, he has left that public location and gone into private to talk to Jesus. And so he's kind of walking back and forth between these two locations. Now, obviously, the synoptics give us other details, like him being sent off to Herod and standing a couple of times before Pilate. But John presents it a little bit differently. Not that it's a contradiction, but his emphasis is different. And so his attention that he pays to the individuals before whom Jesus stands in judgment is a little bit different. So Pilate went out, verse 29, and said to them, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And so this is his way of beginning the formal legal proceedings. Okay, so what is the accusation? It's like a judge taking the seat and saying, what are the charges against this individual, or reading the charges and saying, do you understand the crimes with which you've been charged? They answered, verse 30, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Now, it seems like Pilate probably knew the only way to get a group of Roman soldiers to go on the arrest of Jesus was to somehow have already talked to Pilate. That's why the Roman soldiers were there to assist the Jewish police, temple police, in the arrest of Jesus. And so it seems Pilate probably already knew. It may be some individuals think Pilate is being a little bit difficult with the Jews, making them acknowledge his authority. Okay, but he's still trying to follow the decorum of the law and say, okay, what's his charge? And they said, and I want you to pay attention very closely, because this is the way people work when their motives are not right. They said, if he were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. They didn't answer the question. They did not indicate a single charge. They simply said, you should trust us. We wouldn't have brought him to you if he hadn't been doing evil. Why are we going through all this? Why are you even asking this question? We brought him here, and that ought to be enough. That is a telltale sign that a person is hiding something. And it's a telltale sign because if you are speaking the truth and if you have a person arrested for a correct reason, then it's no problem to produce the evidence. But when you can't produce the evidence, it's saying something. It's very suspicious that the individuals involved are covering something up. And the synoptics tell us that Pilate knew that it was for envy they had delivered him. He knew Jesus wasn't guilty of any of this. Pilate said in verse 31 in response to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law then." Fine, you don't want to give me the accusation, then you do it. The Jews said, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." The Romans had taken that power from them. There's debate about some individuals believe that Rome had obviously taken their power to do the death penalty. There's really no question about that. Some people believe there was an exception that if you brought a Gentile, if a Jew brought a Gentile into the temple area that was restricted for Jewish men alone, that you could be stoned. And you see that happening, stoned or beaten or killed. Either way, you were going to be executed. You actually see that happen in Acts 21 with Paul. They think he's brought a Gentile in. And so anyway, but either way, they don't have the right to put Jesus to death. Now, their charges are different. When he was before them in a religious way, he's guilty of blasphemy. When he's before Pilate, as we'll see a little bit later, they're going to accuse him when we get into chapter 19. It's because he's fighting against Rome. You know, he's claiming that he's the king and not Caesar. But anyway, they say, well, we can't put him to death. Verse 32, this was to fulfill the words that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Now, what does he mean there? How does this discussion, the Jews say, we can't put him to death, you've got to put him to death, how does that fit into what Jesus was saying about his death? Well, basically, Jesus had already predicted what? John 3:14, John 8:28, John 13:32 and 33, that he was going to be lifted up, that he was going to be crucified. Now, crucifixion was a Roman way of execution. The Jewish way of execution was stoning. And so had the Jews killed him, it would have been a contradiction of how Jesus had proclaimed he was going to die. And so the fact that the Romans are going to kill him, he's thus going to be crucified, is consistent with what he's already predicted, that it would be the Romans who went throughout the process of actually putting him to death. So now we shift to inside the headquarters. Pilate walks away from the large gathering. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" So Jesus is saying, okay, before I answer your question, is this because I've been accused of this, or is it you wanting to know personally? Verse 35, Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew?" Very negatively, basically saying, "I'm not a Jew. Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? You tell me the accusation. Surely you know why you're here." Jesus answered, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews." And so Jesus is telling Pilate, look, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not a threat. I'm not looking to physically go to war with the Roman Empire. My kingdom is not of this world. This is not how we operate. If my kingdom were of this world, don't you think we would have put up a fight in the garden? Don't you think my servants would have been fighting that this wouldn't have happened? Verse 37, Pilate then said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king." Now, there are two different ideas about this, what Jesus is doing here. Some people think Jesus is saying something like this: "You're using the word king. That's the word you used." Some people believe that this is part of 1 Timothy 6 and verse 13, the good confession that Jesus professed before Pontius Pilate. "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." I did come into this world for this kingdom purpose, and to bear witness of the truth. That's John 1 and verse 18. We're going back to the prologue now. The only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared or interpreted or exegeted him to us. He has shown us who God is. He came to bear witness of the truth of who God is and to testify of his character. And he says, everyone who is on the side of truth listens to my voice. The people who want to know truth, they will hear me and obey me. And in a way, he's almost extending an invitation to Pilate, saying, and you can be amongst that group if you choose to. But Pilate, of course, his answer simply is, what is truth? Now, again, that's kind of an ambiguous phrase. I mean, there are multiple ways you could see that. It could be a skeptical thing like, what is truth? And so it's not exactly easy to tell what Pilate is doing here. I think most people are of the opinion he's basically saying, what is truth? Like, I don't want to hear it. Like, this is all a nuisance to me. Just forget it. And so he does walk away. There's no basically to it. He walks away. And because it goes on to say at the latter part of verse 38, after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them. So he changes scenes again. So he just walks away. He says, what is truth? So he goes back to the Jews. He said, I find no guilt in him. I don't see the crime. But you have a custom that I should release one man to you at the Passover, kind of a goodwill gesture. They would release one prisoner. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews, referencing Jesus, a dig at the Jews themselves? They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. And so they asked for Barabbas. Now, Barabbas is a very interesting individual, and Barabbas is actually a picture of us. Barabbas, it says he was a robber. The word translated robber here can actually be translated insurrectionist. And when you look at, say, Mark 15, it appears that Barabbas is a violent criminal. It appears that he's probably a zealot. You know, that religious sect. All these religious groups developed out of how do you handle the relationship of serving God and being under a foreign nation's yoke. And the zealots' answer was to basically become terrorists, local domestic terrorists, and cause problems, and would kill people who were not as radical or as faithful in their mind as they were. And so Barabbas, and some people even believe Barabbas's name was Jesus Barabbas, and Bar being son of, or Abbas And rabbi being the son of a rabbi, he may have been the son of a rabbi. Some people have gone so far, and I think there's possibility to it. Whether there's probability to it, I don't know. I think there's possibility to it that the insurrection in which he was involved was maybe even claiming to be a Messiah, trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, he seems to have been the ringleader, because it seems as if it's his two cohorts, his two friends that are crucified alongside Jesus, and that the cross that Jesus is on is actually intended for Barabbas. And so Pilate thinks he's going to get Jesus off by offering them a violent criminal or Jesus, and he thinks that they'll pick Jesus over the violent criminal. However, that's not going to happen. But in this picture, you really see the heart of the gospel, because you see Jesus dying in the place of a criminal. And it's a small snapshot of really what this is about. Jesus, we are all Barabbas, trying to usurp the throne, trying to make our own way. We're all the insurrectionists against God. We've rebelled against his reign. And so we're trying to live it on our own way. And so we have sinned and fought against God. And Jesus is taking the place of us. We are the insurrectionists. Barabbas is a picture of us. And Jesus is willingly taking his place on the cross. And so they're sacrificing their true Messiah for a pseudo-Messiah. And made a monumental mistake in the process. But in that, before we jump to them, we must realize that we are them. We've all been in that position. We've all rebelled against Jesus. We've rejected Jesus. And so Jesus, a common criminal, is chosen. Well, actually more than a common criminal, a very violent criminal, is chosen in the place of Jesus. One who would take life goes free, and the one who restores life in every way is condemned to death. And so many different aspects are at work here. But here we see our Lord walking through all of this in justice, but never for a moment forget that our Jesus is in control of everything that is happening. And he's doing this for our good and for his own glory and the glory of his Father. And in that we find our greatest delight.